A gut feeling saves you from the man waiting for you in a doorway. So this is a story from around 10 years ago. I was 16-17 at the time, but I recently discovered this sub and it instantly brought these memories flooding back to me. At the time I kind of just brushed it off because nothing bad ended up happening to me and put it down to I guess shit just happens to you when you are a woman walking alone at night, but looking back now I realize how creepy it really was. I was coming home on my own on a Thursday night after being out at a pub with some friends. We had been out a little more centrally in the city, so I had to take a bus on my own to get home to my residential neighborhood. I had done this route hundreds of times, so I didn't see it as being particularly dangerous, especially as I live in a fairly nice neighborhood. It was only about 11 p.m. but because I lived in a residential area, and it was the middle of the working week, when I got off the bus at my stop it was absolutely dead and there was no one around. Again, this didn't spook me, particularly as it is only about a 5-10 minute walk from the bus stop to my house. As I turned down a long residential street that leads towards my house I noticed a guy walking further down the street. This put me a little on edge, but I was reassured by the fact that he had his back to me and was walking away from me down the street. As I kept walking down the street I noticed the guy turn around and clock me. That's fine, I thought. I always turn around when I hear someone walking behind me at night, so nothing weird about that. But I noticed as we got further and further down the street he kept doing it, kept checking I was still walking in the same direction as him. At this point I'm starting to get pretty freaked out, particularly as I am painfully aware that we are the only two people around. Just as I was weighing up what I should do he turned down the path of one of the houses to our right and I breathed a sigh of relief. He is going into his house. I was just being paranoid the whole time. The houses in my area are terraced with the front doors being kind of embedded into an enclave at the front of the house. What this means is that from where I was standing, about 50 feet away, I couldn't actually see the front door of the house, as it was obscured by the wall. However, I saw him walk down the path and disappear into the front door enclave, so my logical conclusion was that he was letting himself into his house. I can't describe exactly what made me feel like this, but after that initial feeling of relief wore off I suddenly got this really bad feeling, so I stopped walking and just stood there. There was this tiny voice in my head that said, what if he is just faking you out? The feeling became so strong that I stepped off the pavement and ducked down behind a parked car and just waited. After a couple of minutes of crouching behind the car staring at the house I saw a movement and my heart stopped. The man came back down the path, out into the street and was looking around, looking for me. He must have been waiting for me in the doorway, knowing that if I kept walking I wouldn't see him until it was too late. Unfortunately for him, his hiding place also meant that he couldn't see me, so when I didn't walk past as he anticipated he had to come back out into the street to try and work out where I was. Looking back now I probably should have called the police at this point, but as a scared teenager my fight or flight brain took over and I sprinted down one of the roads running perpendicular to the street that we were on, as I knew I could use it to take a slightly longer route home. I didn't stop running until I got home, where I quickly double-locked the door behind me. Amazingly, I didn't even think to wake anyone in my family up. I literally just went to bed and then woke up the next morning and went to school. I dread to think what would have happened if I hadn't just suddenly got a bad feeling and stopped walking. Part of me thinks that on some subconscious level my brain must have registered not hearing the front door shut after the man had approached it and therefore triggered an alarm in my head, but I had no perception of this at the time. Lesson learned: trust your gut. Reddit, what is the creepiest true story someone has ever told you? My grandmother's entire life she had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking down a long dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. She'd always wake up before seeing what it was. In her 40s, she, her husband, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad wakes up around 3 a.m. and can automatically tell something's not right. He calls out in the darkness, "Dad?" No response. He turns on the bedside light. "Dad?" he says, a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slides out of bed and shakes his father. He doesn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandma's room and started banging on the door. My grandma worriedly opens the door, and my dad shouts something's wrong with Dad. He leads her down the hallway. A long hallway. To the last door on the left. My grandmother reaches the door, turns to left, and sees her husband dead in bed. Heart attack. She never had the dream again.
Don't answer the door at 12:04. A few weeks ago, I moved to a sleepy little town called Meadow Lakes in Alaska, about an hour north of Anchorage. I'll admit, as a software developer, I never thought I'd be living in a remote town in Alaska, seemingly 1,000 miles from nowhere. But I just couldn't refuse the offer. This hot new AI startup based in none other than San Francisco was looking to break new ground by gathering real-world data from remote regions of the world that have been mostly untouched by technology. The project pitch certainly sounded interesting to me, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit the main driver was a free house and a $250,000 salary. The move couldn't have been easier too. I still lived with my parents, so there wasn't much for the movers to page up and take to the new house, and my amazing new salary meant I could realistically buy whatever I needed once settled in any way. It was a 2-day trip from the East Coast to Anchorage, from which I simply had an hour's drive to my new residence. When I finally arrived around noon on the second day of my travel, I was pleasantly surprised to find that not only did all my stuff make it to the house, but it was fully furnished as well. A kitchen full of appliances, a living room with a sectional and recliner. Admittedly, I only cared about the recliner, but the only thing missing was a bed. Not a big deal for me since I was known to fall asleep in my chair back home anyway. No sense changing habits now. Just as I had come back downstairs from touring the rest of my new house, which was entirely too big for a bachelor such as myself, I heard a knock at the door. Upon answering the knock, I was greeted by a rather skinny, middle-aged man with dark gray hair and one of the goofiest smiles I had ever seen. "Good morning, mister," the man said cheerfully. "You must be the newcomer everyone's been talking about. Anyway, my name's Lenny Stringer, and I'm your neighbor just next door. Feel free to stop by and ask for anything at all," Lenny said in the sweetest demeanor, with almost childlike innocence about him. Then Lenny's face immediately switched to a more serious look. "And most importantly, do not under any circumstances answer the door at 12:04. After exchanging pleasantries with Lenny, I mentioned that I was tired from all the traveling, but I'd connect with him later in the week. Not answering the door at 12:04 seemed oddly specific, though Lenny did seem rather in some ways, so perhaps he was just warning me about people causing trouble late at night. This was a rather remote region of the country after all. I had spent the remainder of the day unpacking the few boxes of things I had moved from my parents' house just to get it all out of the way. If I hadn't done so immediately, then anything left in a box would probably stay that way. The sun had set at this point in the day, and I was settled into my new recliner dozing off. It felt as if my eyes had only been closed for 5 minutes when I jumped awake, nearly falling out of my chair at the sound of a loud banging on the front door. Without thinking, I quickly walked over and opened the door. "You didn't even look at the time, did you? Do you want to ruin your life?" Lenny said in an oddly terrified voice. Whatever nonsense he was spewing at this point, he certainly seemed to believe it. "All right, Lenny, I'll pay close attention to the time next time," I said in a rather condescending and annoyed tone. Lenny walked away with a nod as I closed the front door and made for my chair in the living room. Although Lenny's interruption was rather irritating, I've always had a knack for quickly falling back to sleep more often than not. This time must not have been much different from the usual, because I barely remember reclining my chair before passing back out. Knock, knock, knock. I was once again yanked out of a deep slumber by the sound of someone ham-fist knocking at my front door. This time I looked at my watch, and sure enough, it said 12:04 a.m. Clearly, Lenny was committed to whatever fantasy was going on in his mind, but my patience was wearing thin, and I fully planned on letting him know exactly how I felt about getting woken up by nonsense twice in the same night. A few minutes later, I decided to walk up to the door and say, "Lenny, I know it's you. I remembered your silly warning about 12:04, so there, I waited to answer. Now can you stop knocking on my door so I can get some damn peace and quiet?" The knocking had immediately stopped, and there was nothing but silence. Completely uninterested in seeing Lenny's face again, I turned back towards the living room. Upon taking the first step away from the front door, I heard a chilling voice that seemed like it was Lenny. Please, I'm not playing this time. Something is wrong. I don't feel right."
What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American with 5 SIG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to place seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he checked the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here is where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said just as he started to step out onto the trail, he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips as if to tell him to be silent and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later, he said the lead element of a group of NVA, North Vietnamese Army soldiers, walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70 to 80 soldiers equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half-black/half-Creek free man who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a Creek war club into battle.